Today I'm going to talk about my favorite game mechanism in Between Two Cities Capitals. This is the new expansion to Between Two Cities, the only expansion of Between Two Cities, and it comes out today, July 18th. Obviously this is a Stonemaier Games product, that's why I'm wearing the Stonemaier Games shirt, but I'm not reviewing it, I'm just talking about my favorite game mechanism in it. And I'm not the designer, so I feel comfortable doing that. Ben and Matthew are the designers of Between Two Cities. Now, this expansion has 3 different elements to it, and before I played the final version of the game this past weekend, so I played it during development a little bit, but it didn't really need much work. Ben and Matthew did a great job on it, and so it wasn't until this past weekend that I played the final published version. I thought my favorite elements were either going to be the landscape mats, which I really, really love, especially aesthetically. Beth Sobel did a wonderful job on these. Every city gets one of these mats, and you build this 5x5 grid on the empty slots on these mats and around it, and around the mat in any direction, as long as it ends up being a 5x5 grid. And they really do add a lot of color and character to each of the cities, and some interesting choices because each of the configurations is a little different. I really, really like that. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that quite a bit. I also thought that it might be the city tile. So there are 21 of these new tiles, this new tile type. Did I have that upside down? Yeah. These city tile types that want to be adjacent to 2 specific tile types, and they don't want to be next to a different tile type. And each one is different. The combinations are different for each one of these, and the art is different for each one of these too. We had 2 different artists do the art for these buildings. I love those tiles too. I had a great time making decisions in those games. But the surprising thing, what surprised me is that I think my favorite mechanism, my favorite element in this game is the district element. So the third element are these districts. And what surprised me about this is that the districts are the hardest to grok as you're playing Between Two Cities Capitals for the first time. So at the beginning of the game, you put out these little tiles. Each one has a slightly different scoring configuration. But they're basically saying, at the end of the game, look at all the cities and look at different pairs. So you have different pairs of these cards. So this would be like a park tavern pair. So look at park tavern districts in every city and find the biggest one. And the biggest one, say, if it's next to this tile, would get 7 points. And the second biggest gets 5 points. And a district consists of adjacent tiles in a contiguous adjacent tile. So if I had a bunch of parks next to a bunch of taverns, or if I just had a bunch of parks or bunch of taverns next to each other, as long as they're adjacent and connected, that's a district. So if I had like if only 2 tiles were next to each other, that would be a district of 2 tiles. And there are a bunch of different pairings. They're random all at the beginning of the game, so it's a ton of variability in terms of how these are paired together. All 7 tile types are in here. And the reason it's kind of hard to grok is that at the beginning of the game, the only information you have to go on is a landscape tile. And you have to put a tile on one of these slots on the landscape, and then you have to build adjacent to that tile from then on. And so at that point in the game, it's hard to figure out or even start thinking about the districts. And what I realized is that's okay. It's okay to not have to think about that at the beginning of the game, especially when you have all these other interesting decisions to make with the landscape tiles, the normal tiles from the base game, and the new civic tiles. But what emerged from the gameplay, I found, is that as the game advanced, and as our planning came to fruition, so say like we were going after a row of 4 shops. You want 4 of the yellow tiles in a row to get maximum scoring. As you set that plan in motion and try to execute it, it takes less thought later in the game, because if you get that shop, if you get that 4th shop, you know you're going to take it. There's not much of a decision there in the drafting element of these tiles. But that's the point in the game where you have this extra brain space to start thinking about the districts, and that's where they become really interesting. So the game has this pivot point where some decisions become easier, but as that happens, the game opens up with a more interesting decision or an added layer of decision that you can make with these district tiles. I really, really like that emergent gameplay. Because honestly, like the districts were the part of the expansion that I was most worried about and perhaps the least excited about, because they're not the sexiest part of the expansion. You know, these mats are, or these tiles are. But I really, really like how interesting decisions emerged later in the game, or especially at the end of each draft, but particularly in the second half of the game from these district tiles. I really, really enjoyed that. I'm really impressed by it. And I can't wait to get it to the table again to see how those decisions emerge the next time I play. I don't know if you play, you probably have not played Between Two Cities yet because it just comes out today. But if you get it and play it, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the expansion, or I'd love to hear your thoughts about any game, any expansion that has an element like this, where it's something that you really don't pay attention to or almost can't think about early on in the game. But as other decisions become easier later in the game, that element, whatever the mechanism is that you want to talk about, adds a new layer of interesting decisions later in the game that really, really enhances the experience. I'd love to hear about that in the comments. Thanks.